kick it off. Caitlin is back. We've seen her once, and we've got her again. Lucky us. Awesome. So today we are here to chat about everyone's favorite topic, aka more regulation. I am going to let our esteemed panelists introduce themselves. So let's kick it off with Rob.
How you doing? My name is Rob Massey. I'm a tax partner at Deloitte. Started our crypto blockchain practice about 6.5 years ago. Come a long way since then. We look at all aspects of the industry, from infrastructure clients through investing to tokenized business models, and all I do is crypto and blockchain as a tax guy.
And I'm Troy Paredes. I have my own consulting firm, Paredes Strategies. A lot of financial services work, a lot of compliance work, governance work, and a lot of work in the fintech space generally, and in the blockchain, digital asset, crypto space as well. Prior to that, I was a commissioner at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and then other stuff before that, including being an academic.
And I'm Lowell Ness. I'm a partner in the Palo Alto office of Perkins Coie, doing mostly venture capital work in the fintech area for 25 years in Silicon Valley, helping startup companies get venture backed, and in the last 7 or so years been focused really almost exclusively now on Bitcoin and then blockchain and all the crazy stuff happening in crypto.
And Caitlin Long, 22 years on Wall Street before my Austrian conversion, and spent 1.5 years at Symbiont before my public permissionless conversion, and I've been in Wyoming for the last 1.5 years working on the legislative.
Awesome.
changes.
And I'm Arianna Simpson. I run a crypto fund called Autonomous Partners. Before I started investing, I was at BitGo, and prior to that, I was at Facebook. Don't throw darts. So, all right, let's kick it off. I think, so just to set the stage, I'm not a big believer in pre-panel phone calls. I think 99% of them are a waste of time. So we are going to do it live because I didn't do one. I'm going to encourage our panelists to not just smile and nod with everybody else. I think the conversation becomes a lot more interesting when people disagree. So if you have a disagreeable opinion, feel free to jump in. We're all friends here. So on that note, let's kick it off by kind of throwing out a general question and opening it up to anyone to jump in. What do you view as the most contentious yet important issue in the regulatory space today?
I'll go first. Someone's got to go first here. Look, whether it's the most contentious, one of the most consequential is the what is it question, right? I mean, so many of the questions right now, depending upon what the asset is characterized as from a regulatory perspective. So you think about my former agency at the SEC, incredible amount of time, effort, energy, analysis has been going into whether or not a particular asset is or is not a security. Same questions as to whether or not it's a commodity, whether or not it's good or service. We can go down the list. And the reason it's so consequential, just to be very clear about the point is depending upon how the asset is categorized, that's going to affect what regulatory regimes you trigger. So if you have an asset and it's a security, well, now you've triggered the entirety of the federal securities laws. If it's a commodity, you've triggered the entirety of the Commodity Exchange Act, and of course the different tax consequences and other consequences depending upon what it is. So it continues to be a front and center issue. The SEC continues to be noodling through the answer to that question, the most recent illustration being the so-called framework that the staff came out with a few weeks back, where they lay out 14 pages or so of considerations that they take into account in evaluating whether or not a particular asset is a security. So that continues to be, as I said, a front and center question from which so many of the other questions and answers flow.
Well, Arianna totally tapped into my contrarian nature by saying we should take so so completely contrary to my own expertise. I guess it's worth thinking back, and I see that Ricardo is making the rounds as a robot here.
Love it.
Which, I mean, a lot of us remember who else did that and why. And this talking about Charlie Shrem showing up to meetups from house arrest as a robot. And so I don't want to lose, yes, right now the topic du jour is definitely the securities laws, but honestly gauging, I mean, I don't want to sugarcoat anything about what's going to happen next, but the initial reaction and the playbook from the SEC around the 2017 vintage of ICOs, the Airfox Paragon settlement orders, were really pretty light compared to...
I think you lost your mic.
Your sound.
Here, is that better?
No, here. I wonder if I can lend you mine. Okay.
All right,
Oh, there's a hand up.
back up. There we go.
Cool.
It's just me. Oh, no.
There it is.
So going back to sort of the way the SEC handled the 2017 vintage of ICOs, as compared to the way, I think the money transmission regulators handle money transmission violations. We've seen a lot of people, BTCE, a lot of crazy stuff happening where people really are going to jail.
Yeah.
And that could happen with the SEC. They certainly have that ability. That's part of the scope of their remedies, for sure. Although it's not the SEC that does that technically, it's the Justice Department that would show up at your door with handcuffs. So the SEC is kind of step one, but if they really feel like there was fraud happening, that the criminal remedies could apply. But I think the biggest, baddest current landmine you can step on is really doing something with the wrong counterparty and essentially facilitating money transmission violations. So anyway.
Am I allowed to agree?
Yes, agreement is allowed.
Lowell, I think I was going to chime in and say the same thing. I think the FinCEN guidance that came out on Thursday or Friday should be a shot across the bow to everybody. It wasn't new. The only thing that was new that came out of that was that non-custodial wallets are okay. But to Lowell's point, it is criminal for you not to know who your counterparty is if you are deemed a money transmitter and to not file suspicious activity reports. I wrote a piece in Forbes about 9 months ago when the Carpenter cell phone metadata case came out of the Supreme Court. That was a case that said it was illegal for the government to use a private business to basically create a dragnet to collect whatever information it wanted from anybody whatsoever. And the government has to get a warrant, and they can't just use a private business to subpoena all the data. Well, that's exactly what they're doing with the banks, and frankly with the crypto exchanges who are forced to comply with the FinCEN regulations. And in fact, actually, the reason why the lower courts in Carpenter had said what the cell phone companies were doing and the government subpoenaing all their data was legal was because the Bank Secrecy Act had been deemed legal in a case called Miller in 1977 at the Supreme Court. The problem is what's changed is that Miller used to just collect name and address. Now you have name and address and source of funds and know your customer and know your customer's customer and the travel rule to see how many steps the money has made before it came to you. And if you are deemed a money transmitter, which open source software developers could be deemed money transmitters, they did come out and say you can. If you write the code, you're not liable, but if you use your code to transmit anything of value, then you're liable for money transmission. So I look at that and said, God, that's the classified ads, that's flea markets. It's not just digital rights. It's physical stuff too. It's eBay. But basically what the government has set itself up to do is to prosecute whomever they want. And that's scary as hell. And one of the things Wyoming is going to do is we are looking at ways to create safe havens for open source software developers within Wyoming. Again, a state can only do something within the state, but I gave you some pretty big hints about how people are trying to get the data to be deemed contained in Wyoming and the developers to be deemed in Wyoming. So we're doing everything we can to help the industry fight back against what I view as unconstitutional law, but it is the law of the land until it is overturned.
Great. So
Well, this is all important, right? Tax is a pretty big deal right now, and we haven't had anything new come out for a while. And so while I don't know the prescriptions of Troy and Lowell, we all probably have different prescriptions, and we look at things differently, right? For tax, when you hear about people speak about securities laws and commodities and money transmission, a lot of those words are used in a tax context with very different definitions, right? We get used to settling in and focusing on securities laws first. Absolutely big deal, because if you don't get it right, you're going to wear orange. However, when you talk about securities, the word security is defined like 17 different ways in the tax code and regs that we existed, and none of those definitions had digital assets anywhere on radar when they were invented, right? When we talk about digital assets, we make analogies back to World War II type analogies, right? We talk about commodities. The case law is super old school. And we get caught when we take shortcuts making analogies to how the business flow is working. It feels like a commodity, but unless you really dig in to say, what is the thing, which is a question we ask a lot, what's the thing? Right? How is it used? And how is it used in a token issuer versus a token buyer? How does it move through the system? We talk about basis tracking. This is all provocative stuff. And the business models are building on top of one another. And the whole time, we have no new guidance out there. And so this is a little bit scary because we've had a lot of truths developing for a long time now and without anything new coming out. So I have to say tax is a worry, right? The boogeyman is still out there.
So I'm going to lob a question over to Troy at this point. So I think it's pretty clear that many blockchain projects are very global in nature right from the get-go. So how should they think about complying with local regulation if, in some sense, they have to cater to the lowest common denominator across the board?
Yeah, well, it picks up on what I think is a theme across the 4 answers you've already heard so far, which is we don't really have new rules of the road for how to deal with this underlying technology and these assets. So if you're thinking about whether or not you trip the regulatory requirements of the US or someplace in Europe or someplace in Asia or someplace wherever, you got to go back to, as frustrating and challenging to your point as it can be, to the ways in which those questions have historically been addressed and thought about. Say, all right, in light of the learning we have up to this point, whatever it may be, you have some instances where perhaps you've gotten some more particular guidance, particularly thinking about it from the state perspective, but given the best thinking we have up until this point, in terms of how you think about personal jurisdiction, how you think about subject matter jurisdiction, how you think about where the geographic boundaries are or are not, and take that in with the right advisors, jurisdiction by jurisdiction, do the analysis, line it up on top of each other, and try to make what are regulatory compliant, but also practically sensible judgments. That is the kind of process. What I think adds to the challenge across all the things we're talking about as well, and that's no exception, is the way many of the regulatory regimes work is not like the following. So long as you made a good faith effort to get it right, if you got it wrong, you have a chance to cure and move forward, and there's no violation and no potential for an enforcement action. In many instances, we're talking strict liability offenses. So if you have something that is
And can
ambiguous,
you define that?
Yeah, strict liability offenses, if you were supposed to do X and you did not do X, it doesn't matter that you in good faith tried to get it right or that you in good faith didn't believe that regulatory requirement applied to you. If you didn't do it, you're in violation, as compared to negligence or recklessness or actual intent. That's particularly challenging in the context of exactly what Rob was saying, where you have a lot of rules, regulation, been on the books for a long time, didn't anticipate these particular fact patterns where there are gray areas. Because if you get that wrong, there could be significant consequences. So that is to then come back to what I said, having the right folks help think that through, having an appreciation for that, thinking long and hard about what I like to refer to as kind of first principles. What are the regulatory objectives that are at play? How can you satisfy those regulatory objectives? Be mindful of the particulars, lay it all on top of each other, and then make your judgments in a very reasoned way. But if we could get more certainty on so many issues, I think it'd go a very long way to helping everybody in this room, but actually helping to get better results from a policy perspective and from a commercial and markets perspective as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so on the commercial perspective, Robert, obviously you think a lot about tax issues. How can teams properly compensate their employees with tokens or coins, or obviously they want their team members to have a stake in the projects? How should they be thinking about compensation kind of in kind from a tax perspective?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It comes up a lot. The first thing to acknowledge is that what you're dealing with, it's a thing, right? You can't say it's a nothing, and you can't analogize exactly to stock options because those have very specific, equity type instruments have very specific safe harbors built in, and we fall drastically outside of those, but for some other clarifications made. So we see people, doing doing pre-mine, they're doing token allocation, say, oh, it's not worth anything at the time. Well, it can't be a nothing. so the best thing you can do is just give it up and say that it's a something. And the self-help is really defining what it is and actually having evaluation done, which seems a little bit weird, like how would you ever do this? But to actually have some effort made contemporaneously when you're going through these transactions, saying, what do you think it is? What do you think it's worth? And get the transfer done early. And this is contrary to what a lot of people are doing, right? In fact, counsel will sometimes say, no, don't move those now. And this can be a problem. So working with counsel, we come up with, okay, can we transfer something now so that it appreciates when it's already in the hands of the employee or the consultant, right? If you can't do that, then you can work on, there's some other planning ideas out there that are a little more complex, dealing with like sort of escrow accounts or option-like functionality, but it's tricky.
And so how should people think, like what would be some of the processes involved in valuing something, since presumably kind of a more traditional like 409A might not apply?
Yeah, there are valuation firms out there that will take 409A type valuations and apply the same rule sets. And the entrepreneurs look at this like, I don't like this at all. It sort of makes analogies that I don't actually want to make. And it's fair, but absent other clarifying guidance, that's what you got. And you don't, it doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as you have something on hand that says this is what we thought it was at the time, what you don't want to do is have a regulator come back 2-3 years later when the thing's worth a lot, and you have nothing to say what you thought it was worth at the time, and all they have is the benefit of hindsight, where it looks like a really bad answer. So we end up iterating through this a lot with counsel, in fact, with Lowell.
Yeah, and on the securities law side, it is, you all probably saw in the framework that this is, compensating with tokens is a pretty bad fact, or a fact that tends to indicate security status. And it's sort of this notion of, a team that's incentivized to build value in the token creates an expectation in the hands of the purchaser of the token that they'll do that. A number of us worked long and hard to get this mutability concept adopted by the SEC so that a token could at one point be a security and at another point not be a security, as the facts underlying the Howey case law change over time just organically. And idea being you measure it at each point to decide whether it's a security now. Is it, it's kind of like the calling plan, is it a security now? And
what are the points that would go into that for the audience who might not be familiar?
Well, it's basically this fundamental idea that, and we don't know which of these bad facts is dispositive. This may or may not be one that is dispositive, but the point being, I think, having a token compensation plan in place at all creates an implication that you're going to run afoul of Howey. So one answer may be, and this is something we're still iterating on, frankly, internally, is to consider, potentially having a plan at a time when the project is very young. That tends to line up with what Rob is saying in terms of when the value is low. But having a plan set up that unwinds itself at some point, where options have to be exercised, tokens have to be sold in order to support a mutability change to a new set of facts. And the question will be whether that's in the discretion of a board or something like that triggers when you're ready to launch the project, when you're ready to decide that this is no longer a security or shouldn't be. We've got to somehow deal with the fact that there was a plan in place to begin with. So we may see something like that as a new interesting playbook for using tokens as compensation. It's a timing question. Can you do it in the days when you're treating the token as a security? Maybe. And if you're selling it to investors under Reg D as a security, selling it to employees under 701 as a security is probably consistent. But you got to unwind it before you can really take the position it's not a security anymore. So anyway, there's a lot of interesting things happening in the compensation front.
Yeah, and it's clunky because people say, oh, we'll just make 83B elections and fix it. Well, there's a big question out there as to whether or not crypto and tokens is actually 83 property, right? And the way that this is defined, and it's definitely gray. So these people say, oh, I got my election place. Well, how much can you really rely on that is a question. Also, there's real payroll withholding tax. You referenced it, right, Caitlin? And at the moment, I think the state of Ohio is the only one taking crypto in taxes, right? I'm not sure where that is on Wyoming's roadmap.
No, Wyoming doesn't have tax, so we didn't bother with that.
Of course, right? Not even payroll taxes.
Yeah.
Right? So until that happens, right, you have employers having to compensate, right, make those exchange rate and frequently gross up up their employees for additional compensation, to remit those payroll taxes on behalf of their employees because you can't pay the feds in Bitcoin at the moment. And so this is even more clunky.
So Caitlin, 2019, obviously one of the big trends we're starting to see is the rise of DeFi. And I think that brings a lot of excitement, a lot of promises, but also potentially some perils. So what do you think are the opportunities, but also risks associated with this kind of new wave of financial innovation?
Well, one of them is the liability that the regulators really do. They want somebody responsible. And if it is truly a decentralized financial application, which truly with a big asterisk next to it, right? But if it is truly, and there isn't anybody that is a company that is operating that, then there isn't anybody for the regulators to go after. And that is, I think, one of the reasons why FinCEN put out its application, its guidance a couple of days ago. It is interesting, as I alluded to before, that they said that the developers who write code, they didn't say that speech, but they alluded to it. If you just write code, you're fine. You're not a money transmitter. But if you then use it to transmit value, then you are a money transmitter. And so I think the timing of this was precisely because of what you were alluding to, that they're seeing more and more of these decentralized projects being released, and they don't want those to be outside of the all-knowing, all-seeing, all-disclosing money transmitter laws.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add on that? I think one interesting point on this idea of money transmitter and whether it is or it isn't is, a Lightning node. So is that going to be a money transmitter or not? Do any of you have any thoughts on that point? I know it's still a little vague given the guidance isn't too specific yet.
It sure looked from the FinCEN guidance like they consider Lightning nodes to be money transmission nodes and therefore subject to the Bank Secrecy Act. I think this industry, maybe even Lightning node operators, are going to be ground zero for the litigation that I hope will overturn these laws. And I hope the industry can pull together. We are very tribal in this industry, but I really hope that when somebody is in the targets of the regulators, that the industry pulls together and helps them with a legal defense fund.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll just say at a very high level, I think both FinCEN and the SEC, and probably all regulators, appreciate flexibility. And so every time they speak, they sort of say, on the one hand, on the other hand, they give you clarity at the edges, but not in the middle. And that's intentional. It's intentional because they want to see, case by case, what it is and to decide with the benefit of hindsight whether something should be enforced against or not. And so we're probably going to see a lot more of the real rulemaking happen through enforcement, unfortunately, as a result of just that dynamic, unless different heads prevail in some of these organizations and they realize that bright lines are a good thing for this industry for policy reasons. That would be different from the normal MO for regulators. So that's something that Congress might put pressure on them to do. Sometimes bad results in court might put pressure on them, but I think probably it's going to take a lot of outside pressure to get regulators to be more specific.
So in the recent kind of April 2019 SEC guidelines for crypto tokens, they mentioned this idea of an active participant. And those are kind of only loosely defined as someone who could be anything from a project manager or a founder to third parties whose work is contributing to the development of a project. And so some folks have expressed concern that this might create logistical hurdles that are really hard to overcome for some projects. So how should, and you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I think it's an interesting point, so worth digging in. How can projects think about kind of decentralizing themselves in such a way that this issue might not exist for them? And this, I guess, can go for either Troy or Lowell.
I'll start, but you chime in. But so, I mean, the notion behind the word participant in the framework was really to acknowledge the Howey Test. The whole point of the Howey Test, the whole point of the U.S. sort of jurisprudence is to look at the economic substance of what's going on. We really regulate, I would say, not on form, but on substance as a very general matter, which is different from different parts of the world. People make different choices in different countries. But we are constantly debating with ourselves on a case-by-case basis because we create this jurisprudential sort of system based on what we call substance. So what are we really talking about when we say decentralization? Well, I think in a securities law context, it really ultimately comes down to what is the purchaser's, what is a reasonable purchaser expecting when they're buying that token? And it's hard when you're talking about sort of an asset like this that any given purchaser could either be interested in use or interested in investment. So the reasonable purchaser sort of becomes this standard that you have to decide based on all the facts and circumstances. What are most people, maybe, is the best way to say it. But that's not even really the standard. It's reasonable. So the question becomes around participant when you say, how does decentralization affect the Howey test? It's really all about the purchaser's point of view. If somebody is buying because they perceive an issuer, which is a loaded word, but some person, again, a legal person, not an individual, that is, it's not necessarily a corporation or an LLC or a partnership. It could be something else besides that. It's a group of people acting in concert, maybe is another way to say it, that is going to expend efforts to create value in the token. Then the purchaser is relying on that person, that legal person, that issuer, to add value to the token. And that's, I think, where the word participant is intended to be broad. It's intended to sort of say, if people are acting in concert to create value, and it's identifiable as such from the perception of the purchaser, then it feels like a security under the substance of the rules. It's more like a security. Again, where those edges get defined could wind up being through case law, because it's hard to do it in English language, right? Until you get facts and circumstances and you start to add them all together.
Just a couple of points. One is the way in which the SEC has been fleshing out what is and is not a security forever has been through case law for the most part. There are some no action letters. We don't need to go down the rabbit hole of what's a no action letter or not. But there's scores and scores and scores of cases where they take the Howey factors and apply them to the facts and say it is or is not a security. So the only point there is to say the way the SEC has been approaching it here is consistent with the way in which the SEC has approached the whether or not something is a securities question since the inception. Number two, real quick, is on this question of decentralization, a lens through which to look at it as well, and Lowell was getting at this, is one of the key factors for determining whether or not an asset is a security is whether or not any expectation of profits you have as the holder of that asset comes from others' efforts. So you could think about it this way: to the extent, right, the things that are contributing to the network, driving value, is a result of a lot of different people's efforts, then it can debunk the notion that there's any, if you will, centralized entity whose efforts predominate in terms of driving the ultimate value. If you have that as a framework, and then just to add a little bit of a finer point, if you take that as a general framework and compare it to a quintessential security, by that I mean, let's just say stock. If you take stock, fair enough, not an investment contract, not to get too into the jargon here, but if you take stock and say, well, what's that really about? Quintessential security. It's about me owning a claim to the company. I sit somewhere in the capital structure. And what's the centralized body, if you will, that's driving value? Well, the centralized body in the context of a corporation is the board and the management team. So my interest is a claim to the profits of the enterprise sitting somewhere in the capital structure where those profits depend upon just how effective the board and the management team are. I think it's useful to have that just as a bit of a reference point, because if you get to decentralization, you don't have a board in that sense. You don't have a management team in that sense. You may still have folks with the promoter who are involved, but if you have a lot of other folks who have a significant hand in it, it starts to put pressure on whether or not you would say that any expectation of profits I have, even if I have an expectation of profits and it's not really about consumption that I'm trying to get, does it really come from the efforts of others? So that's how that notion, I think, fits within the framework. Again, facts and circumstances, the regulator has not given bright lines on where to draw that line.
And I guess I'll just point out that the word others in efforts of others cannot be so broad as to say it's anyone other than the holder themselves. It's not merely that the holder is expecting passive profits, because you get passive profits from commodities, you get passive profits from a lot of investments. It really does come down to this notion, if if the others in that sentence is, kind of everyone contributing to supply and demand on a market, well, that's too broad. That's not really where the dividing line is between commodities and securities. But this dividing line between commodities and securities has been a moving target for years and years and years. And so, but this is the heart of it, is what does the word others mean? And what is a common enterprise? Maybe that feeds into this. I mean, but these are kind of the place where we're really going to need the clarity, I think, to really hang our hat on a decentralization trigger for mutability.
Rob, you look like you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to obviously lend the tax dimension to this. And we talk about, centralized business models. And even if there's not a business intent, there's still transaction flows like. We have transfers of value, we have relationships between people. And if that's controlled by a group of people or an enterprise, then you sort of know what that is. And you can choose your favorite flavor of LLC versus corp or whatever it is. And you sort of know what to do with that. There's a lot of confusion and maybe a lot of BS built into the blogs about decentralization, saying that it's no one's. Well, there's not really the concept that it's a nothing, right? You're attached to a jurisdiction, probably, somewhere. There's humans somewhere doing something. And so there's rights of a jurisdiction to tax you. And so better to self-help and say, what is that thing that you just created, right? And it may be centralized at one point in time and then becomes decentralized later. But you got to really think about compliance. You got to think about the taxability of the exchange. You need to think about the other things like informational reporting. To the extent that you're facilitating a transaction between parties, just like an exchange here, right? They have reporting and withholding obligations. So thinking about the compliance on the front end and what is it, call it something, and deal with it on the front end, it just makes sense. Because if you don't, right? I mean, you can guess what happens if you create the monster, right, and then set him off walking down the street and he does damage. Guess who they're going to come after, right? So think about it on the front end as you're going through these models, and we iterate through this stuff a lot. What is it on the front end and what is it later, and how you design something that's not going to offend too many people, because it's got to be a thing somewhere.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Caitlin, so as many blockchain protocols have kind of touted themselves as being trustless with large air quotes around them, and as legacy institutions think about coming into this space, what do you think are some measures that folks should be taking in order to prevent another financial crisis?
Well, I think the legacy system is probably too far gone, to be blunt. I saw this.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's very leveraged. It's much more leveraged than it appears, and the reason is that most securities don't stay stable. They move around. They're constantly being lent and relent and relent and rehypothecated and sliced and diced. And the reason that happens, even if you try to set it out, I learned this firsthand when I was running the pension business at Morgan Stanley, and we were trying to transfer a pension fund securities to settle the pension obligation, transfer them to an insurance company, and those securities were segregated in a non-lending custody account. And the custodian called the chief investment officer the day before the deal was supposed to close and said, we don't have 15 of the securities, they've been lent out. And he said, well, you weren't supposed to lend those. And he said, well, we know. We weren't supposed to lend them, but we lent them anyway. And luckily, by that point, I knew enough. Yeah. And again, some of this is nefarious. Some of this is just bad bookkeeping. Because I think it's possible that it wasn't nefarious. And what happened was all those securities are held in what's called an omnibus account. And there was no flag that said that a certain percentage of them were attributable to non-lending accounts, and so don't lend these. So what happens is they all got lent out. And what's crazy is the chief investment officer was looking at his screen, and there were the securities in his brokerage account. But the custodian didn't have them.
Whoops.
And I learned at that point, I don't trust my brokerage account. And then when I dug into this, there's a guy at the IMF who's done amazing work on the government bond markets in the world, and how many times each government bond is owned by different organizations or individuals. And he estimated that it's 3 times. So for every US Treasury bond, there are 3 people who own it. And the question is, why aren't the auditors catching this? Well, because the accounting standards actually require all those parties to report that they own the very same asset. Okay, so CFTC Chairman John Carlo is onto this, and early on he said this is one of the reasons why blockchain technology is going to be so great, because we're going to be able to pull out all that double, triple, quintuple, sextuple counting of the very same asset and figure out how solvent the financial system is. He didn't use those words, but guess what? Because of the way that treasury bonds work, those are the high quality liquid assets that give you the highest capital. Everybody owns them, and guess what? There's really only one for every 3 who report that they own them in their capital structure. So I look at that and say, I don't trust the solvency of any of the legacy financial institutions. The Dole Food case is an exclamation point on that. How did the Wall Street systems allow 1/3 more Dole Food shares to be issued than there were actual Dole Food shares outstanding? That is a Delaware court case from 2017, very recent. You know, and I talked yesterday about the Merrill Lynch problem. Merrill Lynch, after the financial crisis, was commingling customer dollars with their own dollars and was commingling $58 billion a day on average of customer securities into an account that Merrill's lender had a first priority lien on.
Yikes.
And the SEC said if Merrill Lynch had gone down, that customers would have lost significant money. It is as black and white. There it is in the SEC press release where they fined Merrill Lynch $415 million.
So do you think, in light of all of that, keeping records on chain is the way folks should be thinking about it?
Absolutely, but I see Jimmy Song sitting in the audience. He and I both kind of independently, he's a developer, I'm not, but we independently kind of did our detour through the enterprise blockchain space, and I've listened to Jimmy's podcast. I agree at the end of the day that there was a great attempt from the enterprise private blockchains to try to fix these problems. And they ran into huge incumbency problems and the fact that these are rip and replace type systems, they're not incremental upgrades. And the incumbents were just not going to rip and replace everything out. It would have been too expensive to do so. And so I'm now convinced that it's all going to be in the public permissionless chains, and we're just going to be coming around the backside of the mainstream industry with this really solvent system where we know the assets are where they are because we control them ourselves. Whereas we're not trapped in this legacy incumbent system that we don't know is solvent. We can't trust the audited financial statements, and we don't know where the assets are.
Great, thank you. Okay, we're coming up on time. I want to see if we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience, if anyone has any. Don't be shy. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about, going back to the issue of money services business and lightning nodes, it just doesn't seem very practical or possible for a lightning node, particularly because they can also have private channels, and I don't know how that's supposed to work with the money services businesses and KYC.
Yeah, the question is lightning nodes and KYC, and how is that supposed to work? And it's a great question because I think the government, in theory, wants every lightning node operator to be a money transmitter and file suspicious activity reports for every transaction that runs through their node. But the practical reality of that, that's the problem. So one important distinction, the federal money transmission laws are all about the Bank Secrecy Act, Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism financing. That's about the all-seeing government getting access to everything, right? That's why I think that's unconstitutional under the Carpenter cell phone data case for the same reason that was unconstitutional. But again, it's the law of the land. The state money transmitter laws, by contrast, are going after something different. They're going after custody of funds when they move between one sender and a receiver, but it's the federal one that's the big issue, and that's where all that FinCEN guidance it comes out. The law is written so that the government can go after anyone it wants to be blunt.
To stay on the theme of impractical, it's not then, if you get to a node, right, being a money transmitter, it's not a big step to saying that they also have tax compliance obligations, which is even more wacky, right? I know that's exactly the look, right? So not a stretch, but you see how it just layers on, that's where it starts.
Great.
Is there, this may be wishful thinking, but is there any effort out of regulators that you see to move towards a consistency in the what is it question, i.e., are we going to live with it? No, the Treasury Department's going to call it money so that they can do money transmitting laws, and the SEC is going to call it security so that they can govern that, and then the IRS is going to call it property because they want to tax your lot codes. I mean, is there any obligation, and will the courts help, or will it be anything?
I mean, there is a bill in front of Congress that Darren Soto and Congressman Davidson, I think, put together, that's trying to define sort of some of the boundaries. They're both freshman congressmen. They're good-hearted guys, but I unless we all really get behind it in a big way, it's probably not going to go through. But yeah, it's probably Congress that needs to define some of this stuff, because the regulators, for all the reasons I mentioned before about flexibility, are trying to stay neutral.
Yeah, I would have to say that Hogan Taxonomy Act, the second draft of it added federal preemption, which is a can of worms, and I'm against that part. If they can pull that part out, it's certainly, because it preempts all the states, right? And a couple of things, like you've got New York up here, which is by far the worst. Then you've got Wyoming, which is by far the best. Where's the federal going to come out?
Unbiased opinion, naturally.
The federal's going to come out pretty close to New York, right? So you lose the ability to vote with your feet. And the states are going to come out pretty hard against that federal preemption piece. And that's an interesting split that's been created in the industry, because there are a lot of big players in the industry who want to build regulatory moats around what they've already built. And that's not necessarily, their interests are not necessarily consistent with those of the individuals and the small startups in this industry.
And the opposite of preemption would be passporting state laws. Like if one state says yes, you can do that anywhere. And then obviously that's sort of the very diametric opposite.
That would be
great.
ideal, yeah.
One just small point on this, on your question. One of the things to keep in mind is that the different regulatory bodies have different missions. The SEC's mission is different than the CFTC, is different from the Fed, is different from fill in the blank. And that in part explains why each of them is looking at it through the lens of their mission, their jurisprudence, their definitions, and you sometimes can get each of them saying, hey, it falls within the scope of what we're doing, and then you throw the tax into the mix, that layer of complexity, that at least in part explains why you see a lot of folks saying, hey, we have jurisdiction.
Yeah, this is a critical point, right? And there was even something written not long ago saying, gosh, it's bizarre that the IRS is publicly saying now we're going to juice up enforcement actions, and yet there's no new guidance coming out there, which it seems inappropriate, and it is. But this is kind of the world we're at. Similar tax, similar to what was mentioned with the SEC, a lot of the rules that have been developed have come through case law, right? And we don't have a lot of big players right now litigating this space. We may, right? It's going to get to that point. What's happening in parallel, which is not transparent yet, is that there are certain people that it's meaningful now that are seeking private letter rulings. It's kind of like a no action letter, but private letter rulings on a very specific transaction. Once that's finished, they get redacted and made public. So it's conceivable that in the not too distant future, we'll see certain taxpayers where this is a very meaningful transaction, they're paying us to really get it right, go after the private letter ruling, and then it's redacted and made public. It's not super authoritative guidance, but at least it's a fact pattern that you can think about the analysis and do something with it more than today.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists. Let's give them a hand.